Hey guys, so today we're doing a FuelTech FT550 on a 1UZ non-VVTi, so that's an 89 to 97 engine. So, let's get into it. Right, so as I said, this is a harness for a FuelTech FT550 going onto a 1UZ non-VVTi, so that's a 89 to 97 engine. It'll work for obviously all of them, although there are variations between the different years. So in this case, it is a completely brand new harness. It is a modular harness, so obviously there's a bunch of expandability and changeability in the harness. So first thing we're going to do is let's go through that build process and you can see exactly what's going into that harness and you can see all the sub-harnesses that we've built. Right, so there you go. Now you can see everything that's gone into the process of building this harness. So as per usual with all of our harnesses, we're going to go through three things today. One is the layout of the harness. Two is the testing of the harness with ignition on. And three is the testing of the harness with the engine actually running. Okay, so let's jump into the layout section and let's make our way down to the ECU over here. Okay, so at the back of the ECU over here, you can clearly see we've got just two connectors on there. They're both keyed differently, so obviously you can't plug them into the wrong one. We then have the USB port on the back there, and underneath there we have a little nipple for the map sensor. So this is a built-in map sensor. So you have the option to use either a built-in map sensor or an external one, which in this case we're using an external one, which I'll show you in a minute, because some people don't like to bring the vacuum hose inside the vehicle through the firewall, etc. Okay, so ECU, very simple, USB cable, two connectors, nothing to worry about. Coming out in this direction over here, we have our connection for the fuse box. So again, that goes to that connector over there and that connector over there. Both two different connectors, you can't plug them in the wrong one. And obviously that is the customer connector, and it's got a bunch of wires in there that the customer is going to connect inside the vehicle. And we'll go through all of that over there. Okay. Right, so as you can see, this fuse box does not have a mount on it. Obviously the customer is going to be mounting this in his own mounting system in the center console. So therefore it was completely pointless on putting a mount underneath this, because it would just push it further and further towards the inside of the vehicle. One other thing you'll notice about this fuse box, the keen-eyed among you, is you'll see that there's actually an opening for a fuse, and that is normally for the idle speed control 12 volts. Now, a little quirk with the FuelTech that I found out when doing this is that they normally say that if you're using a stepper motor, it uses the 4 yellow outputs on an FT550. So the outputs are basically H bridges. They can do drive-by-wire or they can do stepper motors. Unfortunately, what they don't tell you is that basically when you're using a Toyota idle speed control valve, the way you have to control it is not to supply the 12 volts in the middle and use the 4 yellow outputs to supply the idle speed control valve. So again, because it's a modular harness, we wanted to work on a bunch of different applications if needs be. We have basically taken the 12 volts to the throttle sub harness. In this case, all we're doing is we're effectively removing the fuse from the idle speed control supply. And if the customer ever was to change over to, say, a 2-wire PWM system, we can just put a fuse back in there again, and he can have his 12 volts at the idle speed control motor and able to use either a 2 or 3-wire PWM motor if he so desires. So in this case, the ECU is providing 12 volts to the coils on the idle speed stepper motor, and that is how it is controlling that. So please be aware of that, because if you try and use it in the traditional setup, it's going to ask you to use the blue outputs, which are normally used for things like fuel pump relays and so on and so forth. So again, be very, very careful when you are wiring these up and make sure that you do that correctly. So if you're going to use the 4 yellow outputs, you cannot use the 12 volts being supplied to the idle speed control valve in the middle. So you'd leave those 2 blank and you'd only connect pin 1, 3, 4, and 6. Okay. Right, so that's the fuse box side sorted out. Super, super simple. So let's move along, and then we're going to go back to the ECU. And out here, we've got 3 expansion plugs on the harness. So let's start going through them. So one is going to be expansion. So this is an unused input or output. In this case, it's just a 1 analog input that's left over. So I've got 5 volt sensor ground and the analog input there. Over here we've got CAN. So again, this is to add CAN devices to the ECU. So there are 2 CAN buses on the FuelTech FT550, and therefore you've got CAN A and CAN B, again, high and low. And then we've got 12 volts and ground. So you can actually power the devices that you connect to the CAN bus directly from here. You don't need to find an extra power supply there, okay? Lastly is pedal, and you're probably wondering, why would you have a pedal connector on an engine that doesn't have drive-by-wire? Well, again, because we like to make these harnesses future-proof, we have put everything in for drive-by-wire, because as I said, the FT550 can do drive-by-wire. So all the way to the throttle sub-harness is everything required for drive-by-wire. And in that case, we then have to have a pedal plug inside the car, so you can obviously connect that to an electronic accelerator pedal. If the customer ever was to change his mind and go with, say, like a Bosch drive-by-wire throttle, he can literally do that by bolting the throttle on. We'll unplug the throttle harness at the back over here, and we'll send him out a new one that's going to work for whatever throttle he decides to fit. So again, this is the benefit of having the modular system. If you want to change, there's not a major issue in doing so. Okay. Right, so moving along, as you can see, it's obviously a very long harness. It's got to reach all the way inside the vehicle, but it goes all the way down there. We go to our grommet. We've got our piece of epoxy-lined SCL, and that's not shrunk down because obviously we want to get the customer to get in the car, decide where that's best going to be, and when that is the case, you just grab a heat gun and you shrink that down. It's got epoxy in. It'll seal everything up so water doesn't come down through the harness and towards the ECU. Moving along from there, obviously you can see how long it is, and we end up at our molded T-piece boot over here. So the harness is going to go that way, and it's going to go that way. So let's do this way because it is a very short and small section of harness. But basically it comes out here, gets tucked away down in through there. Nothing breaks out here. Comes out at the end over here where it breaks out, and it goes to your coolant temperature sensor. So we put that on a sub harness so you can change the coolant temperature sensor if you so desire. Coming down there, we then have our IAT. So again, obviously everything is labeled for you guys on there so you can see exactly where it goes. But this is your IAT sensor. Again, on a sub harness, so you can obviously remove this and fit whatever IAT sensor that you want. In this case, because the customer is putting it at IS200, he's replacing an old Speeduno harness, and he's using his IS200 intake air temperature sensor. Because it's naturally aspirated, it's absolutely fine. I know it's not a fast response one, but it doesn't need to be on a naturally aspirated engine. The temperature shouldn't really change all that often in terms of air coming into the vehicle. Okay. Right, moving along, and the last section we have down here is going to be our alternator sub harness. So again, in this case, he has the later generations, so 95 to 97 LS400. So he has the oval plug on there, but obviously you get the early 89 to 91s that have the big round plug, and some others on the Sora, I think, had the big round plug as well. And obviously because you can fit a 3UZ alternator on here, in fact, this is a 3UZ alternator, but even the second generation ones from like the LS and the GS430 that came with the 3UZ or the 6-speed autos, they have the 4-pin square plug. They bolt directly onto this engine. So again, you can use those ones if that's all you can get your hands on, and we can make you a plug for that 4-pin plug from this one over here. Just a note, obviously, because the ECU is controlling, is actually the dash, sorry to say, obviously things like the alternator light and so on are all going to the ECU. There's no point in sending them anywhere else, because obviously that's where your dash is. Okay, right, so that's that section over there, super nice and simple. Let's start at the back over here. Just gonna take a seat down here. Right, so coming out here, we've got quite a lot, so let's get started. So first little section you can see over here is gonna be for a map sensor, okay? This case is using a standard IS200 map sensor on there. Again, it's naturally aspirated, not turbocharged. There's no problem there whatsoever. Now, obviously, if you wanted to use the map sensor that's built into the ECU, you can do that, no problem. And therefore, you would have a analog input, a 5 volts, and a sensor ground ready there to connect to whatever you so desired if you had another sensor that you wanted to put in there, okay? Also coming out here is a smaller section over there, and that is going to our starter solenoid, okay? Normally you'd see our big 8-pin plug here because we'd have the wiring for the knock sensors, but in this case we don't. It is just the starter solenoid. So that brings me to my next point that you guys must be aware of. The FuelTech FT550 does not have any knock control, okay? So what that means for you guys is obviously the ECU is unable to detect knock and therefore pull timing and save your engine if it did occur. Now, on a naturally aspirated 1UZ non-VVTi, not really that much of an issue. They're not super knock limited, but what I would always advise you guys to do with the ECU that doesn't have knock control is when you get it set up, when you get it tuned, go and grab the fuel that is the cheapest and the nastiest that you can, because obviously if you go get Shell 99 and your tuner puts it on the dyno and sends it to the absolute maximum power, and you get stuck and you can only get to a supermarket to get fuel, well, you're going to be in trouble. Again, especially more so in a turbo application. So again, please be aware of those limitations. So if you are going to be running this with any sort of forced induction, turbo, supercharger, and so on, it would be really imperative that you make sure that your tuner did not push the engine to the absolute max, because obviously if you ever got a bad bunch of fuel, that you would then not be able to pull timing in the event that the engine did decide to knock. And as we know, knock will kill your engine. So again, just be super careful about that, guys. Okay. All right, next up, coming off of here, again, it's just coming off the top down there, is going to be your ground connection. Okay, so that just goes to a ring eyelet over there. Now you can see on the back here, there are a couple of places you can bolt them down. You've got there, there, and there. I always use the top one, and I ask you guys to use the top one because this is just a singular hole, threaded hole, and it's a completely machined flat surface that bolts to. You notice on here there's actually a much bigger cavity, and the same applies over here as well. I think this is actually where the standard harness earth to, but I prefer to use that one again because it's only the threaded hole, not a big cavity around it, and it then takes you straight to a machined flat surface, okay? And obviously you still have your earth that's going to be coming from the block to the either the chassis or sort of block, chassis, battery, and so on as well. You are still going to have those earths, but this is the only earth for the entire engine harness that's on here, okay? Next up coming along here is going to be your ignition harness, okay? So again, on a sub harness for you, so you can obviously just unplug this and take out all 4 of these coils in one go. Now obviously this is for the right bank, so remember you're always looking from the back of the engine. This is the right bank, so that's going to be cylinder 2, 4, 6, and 8. Okay, so again, you can call it the right bank, some people call it bank 2, and it's easy identifiable because bank 2 has cylinder 2 at the front. On the left bank is the odd number, so you got 1, 3, 5, and 7, and obviously that can also be referred to as bank 1. So again, because cylinder 1 is at the front there. Okay, but yeah, so obviously this is also a nice system because you can remove all of these coils, as I said, to change spark plugs. That avoids you having to disconnect the standard connectors. Standard connectors on any engine harness from a manufacturer are not going to have a good lifespan in terms of connect and disconnects as something like a DTM connector would, okay? So that just helps these live a bit longer. When you want to do your servicing, you just unplug that, pull that out, and go from there. Obviously, you can use one of these earth holes to clamp the harness down here. Clamp this side on the engine side, not on this side, because obviously you want to be able to pull this off and take all the coils out. And also, I haven't mentioned, if you want to change coils to a different type altogether, well, we can just make a new harness from here to whatever coil you want as well. So you can upgrade these further down the line. So maybe if you're not running these, let's say you're running IS200 coils or Toyota Yaris coils, and then you want to change to these, or you want to change to, say, Nissan coils, or the K20 coils or whatever, it doesn't really matter. Just give us a call. We'll make your sub harness to match whatever coils that you fit. Okay. Right, so that's those ones over there. So I think these are the last two that we're going to be doing now, and that's going to be your throttle and your injector plug, okay? They're both 12-pin DTM, so just make sure you get that correct. Obviously, they are labeled, okay? So you shouldn't get that incorrect, but yeah, please make sure you're checking the labels when you are fitting these connections on, okay? Right, so these do go under the intakes. What we're going to do is cut to a photo now so you can see what that looks like. As you can see, it goes off to the left to injector 1357. Goes off to the right to injector 2, 4, 6, and 8. It also comes off and goes, the throttle harness comes off and goes to the TPS sensor on the throttle. And obviously it goes straight to the front to go to the idle speed control valve. Okay. Right, so let's show you those idle speed control valves and TPS, because obviously you can't see them when they're inside the vehicle, but there's that one over there. And there's the idle speed control over there. So obviously you're looking at with this top half off, so you can't see where these connect because these are attached to the top half on there. All right, everything else you can see. Obviously you can see from the connectors that I've got here, the customer's not using the original IS200 injectors. So we've got the correct connectors for him on there. So I'm adapting them to my engine's original 1UZ-FE injectors over there. Okay. Right, so that's that section over there. So I think next thing to do is let's pop over to the other side and we'll carry on from there. Okay, so let's just see if I can gently move this out the way. Okay, so the harness runs along there. We then have another P-clamp over here, and we have a couple of breakout sections over here. So the first one, get this vacuum pipe out of the way. First one is going to be your coils for your left bank. So again, same thing, you can just clamp those down on the earthing mounting points over there. That'll keep that nice and tucked away at the back there. And obviously they run along here. Exactly the same as the other side. It's coil 1, 3, 5, and 7. You can unplug them to pull all of them out to do your servicing. You can unplug them to change to a different coil if you so desire as well, okay? Also coming out here in this particular case is going to be a fuel pressure sensor. Okay, so again, the customer is having a fuel pressure sensor. So obviously there's his sub harness to go into that. It's going to be a Honeywell 150 PSI sensor that we're going to supply with the harness for him. Okay. All right. And the last section is the section that's actually going to go all the way down, tucked along inside there towards the front of the engine. Okay. Now, obviously you can go more extreme. You can sort of run it down underneath here and so on and so forth to make it look a bit neater. Obviously I've got it on for testing purposes here. But it runs all the way along there, then it's going to break out at the front just to go to the cam sensor over here. Okay, so again, this cam sensor is only picking up one singular tooth, just for your triggering purposes. And the rest of it goes down along through there, down to here, and then we just have two sections that break out over here. One is going to be for oil. So again, this is designed to run either a oil pressure switch, which is what you get standard on a 1UZ non-VVTi, and that then goes to the ECU, so it's a direct digital input. We then also have oil pressure and oil temperature. So you can either fit a combined sensor, you can fit two separate sensors. Everything is there included in the plug for you guys to do that, okay? In this case, the customer is not aware of how long the oil pressure and temperature sensors are gonna be from this plug. So we're getting this done first to get it off to him, to get it all plugged on the engine. Then he's gonna send us the measurements for that and we will create that particular harness for him. Right, the only other section that breaks out here and comes down to here is gonna go to the crank sensor over there. Okay, right, so while I'm here talking about the crank sensor, I'm going to let you in on something I did figure out when we were playing with this FT550 ECU. Now obviously, if you do know these engines very well, the 1UZ non-VVTi, how it works for triggering patterns is on the crank you have 12 tooth trigger wheel with no missing teeth. Okay, so there it is, 12 teeth, no missing. So obviously just with that signal, you could never run this engine on any ECU because the ECU would have absolutely no idea when any cylinder was a top dead center. Now there is many ways to skin a cat. You could technically shave one of those teeth off, then you'd have a missing tooth. That would get you there. But in this case, what we're gonna do, and on advice from other people that have had experience with this, we have fitted the 36-2 trigger wheel from a 1UZ VVTi. Also 3UZ VVTi as well. So again, they are really cheap to get hold of from Toyota. I could put the part number down in the description for you, and it's simply a case of pulling your crank pulley off, swapping it out, plugging it back in again. Now, obviously, apparently the FT550 doesn't really work all that well with the 12-tooth trigger, or what I've been told. So obviously with the 36-2, we've been told that it works much better. Obviously, there is a benefit to the 36-2. You are getting much more resolution. So in other words, on a 12-tooth trigger wheel, As you can imagine, 360 divided by 12, I think is 30 degrees. So the ECU only picks up a tooth every 30 degrees. Whereas if you have a 36 minus 2, technically speaking, because it's 36 teeth and 360 degrees, you're getting a reading every 10 degrees. So the ECU has much more accurate data. So do bear that in mind. But my advice at the moment would be, if you guys are wanting to run a FuelTech FT550, it's just to change over to the 36 minus 2 trigger wheel from a 1 and 3UZ VVTi. Again, the price of it is so cheap, it is just not worth taking the risk of trying to run it on the 12 tooth, okay? Right, so that is the other side over there, and that is the crank sensor, okay? So this is obviously the entire harness, where it goes. You've seen the photos of what it looks like inside there, how it runs through the center, goes out to either side, so it does look nice and neat inside there. Obviously, when everything's on, you can get these all nicely tucked away, and if you want to P-clamp them in other places as well, absolutely no problem at all, okay? Right, so now that we've gone through the entire layout of the harness, obviously other things you do need to connect is going to be things like the alternator power, okay? So in this case, he's doing an IS200, so he's going to be connecting that to the fuse box that lives by the battery in this side of the engine bay over here on a right-hand drive vehicle. If it was a left-hand drive vehicle, the battery would be here, alternator would go from there to there. As I mentioned earlier about the grounds, you're going to be running one from your block to your chassis to your battery. That is kind of the normal setup that you guys would have. And if you want as well, because it doesn't hurt, engines do love grounds, you can use one of these unused ground mounting points at the back of the cylinder head, and you can run that straight to the firewall, okay? So from Toyota's perspective, if you want to do a complete Toyota grounding system, you're going to have block, chassis, battery. You're also going to have one from the gearbox bolts to the chassis, and you're going to have one from the cylinder head to the firewall. That's pretty much every Toyota and Lexus that you'll come across. You'll see that that's the setup that they do run. Whether that chassis ground from the block is at the front of the engine, like on some 1UZ VVTIs from LS400, or whether it's in the middle on the side, it doesn't really matter. That's the one that's doing the starter motor. So you want to make sure that's your nice thick one. The one from the cylinder head is obviously just for the engine harness, so it doesn't need to be a thick one. And the one from the gearbox is actually usually just a braid. Like, it's not even a wire, it's just a braid that they bolt on from the gearbox bolt to the chassis leg as well, okay? Right, so that's the entire layout. Hopefully everything there is nice and easy to understand, not super complicated. So what I'm going to do now is, in this particular case, we have made some alterations specific for this customer on this one. But let's go through these customer plugs on here. So I have kind of been through the 3 that I've got there, but I'll just go through them individually now as part of this, which every customer gets in their welcome pack. But let's focus on this 9-pin plug over here. As I said, because this ECU is the dash, obviously there's a lot of differences from what we normally do. We'd normally have things like coolant temperature coming out, alternator light, oil light, all of that type of jazz. But in this case, that does not need to be put in, because obviously the ECU is the dash. So all of that information is coming directly to you in front. So pin number 1 of that is a red 14 gauge wire, which I have over there, and that is going to be the permanent 12 volt supply. So now this is what's supplying the engine harness with power. It also supplies the starter motor solenoid with power, obviously not the starter motor. That has the big thick cable that you see here going to the battery, but that is that, and the fuel pump as well, okay? Hence the reason why it's 14 gauge in there, okay? Now again, I have put down permanent 12 volts. It's a force of habit from the other ECUs, but obviously this one doesn't actually need to be put to permanent 12 volt supply. But again, I just like to keep it standardized for all of my harnesses over there. So in this case, you can technically take it to an ignition source, but obviously because of the draw on it, the fact that it's doing the starter solenoid, the fuel pump, and all of that type of jazz, I'd rather just take it to a permanent 12 volts and put something like a 40 amp fuse on there, okay, and treat it like a main feed-in for your tire engine harness, okay. Next up is number 2, that's black and yellow, and that's going to be start signal. Okay, now this ECU, like my other ones when I do Lynx, Haltex, and so on and so forth, the ECU in this case is going to be controlling the starter motor, right? So that signal, that black and yellow wire over there, can either take a 12 volts or a ground. You just need to set it up in the ECU correctly, and therefore all you're going to basically be doing is touching it once or turning the key once to the start position, and then the ECU will take over and it'll crank the engine until it reaches above 400 RPM, and then it'll shut off the starter motor. You can also dictate how long it cranks over for. So I do, like, say, 3 or 4 seconds. You can make it 7 seconds, 10 seconds, whatever you want to do. Okay. But yeah, so that's it. So that start wire there doesn't actually go to the fuse box or anything like that. It goes straight to the ECU, and it tells the ECU that you want to start the motor. ECU takes over, activates the starter motor relay over there, which will then send power down to the starter solenoid to obviously activate the starter motor. Number 3 is not going to be in there, and it is basically an unused output from the ECU that can be used in the future. So again, we can just add a wire into that 9-pin plug if we need to. Obviously, it's not sealed up or anything like that, so there's no need to add it unless it is actually needed. Number 4 is going to be gray, and that's the one I have over here, and that is going to be the fuel pump. Okay, so that wire can technically be supplied directly to your fuel pump. You don't need to run it through another relay unless you have a very power hungry fuel pump. Then you can obviously use that to trigger the 12 volt side of a relay. Okay, obviously in this case, the reason it's over there is I've obviously connected it to my fuel pump that's going to be running the engine in a minute when we go to start. Right, now we're getting on to the things that we have added in for the customer. So you'll see there we do have 5 relays where we normally have 4. So in this case, we have got another red wire over there, which is again a 14 gauge wire. And that is going to be for the cooling fan. Okay, so the customer wanted this one to control the cooling fan. So normally we'd have B12 over there, and we'd have another one for B11 or blue 11. And that would then be coming out for the customer to use. In this case, it's going directly to the cooling fan relay. And coming down to here, we'll skip number 7 because there's nothing in 6 and 9. And number 8 is the white 14 gauge over there, and that's the one you're going to run to the 12 volts of your cooling fans. Remember, with the cooling fans, you can just ground it directly by the radiator. You don't need to run the ground all the way back to the battery or anything like that. You'd run the ground just directly to the body as soon as it came off the actual radiator itself. But then that wire over there is the one you're going to run along the car to the front to the actual cooling fan to supply the 12 volts. And in this case, obviously, it is controlled via the ECU. So the ECU is going to turn it on and off. Okay. Lastly is number 7, black with a red, and that is your ignition. So again, this is just to turn on the system. So you'll see all of these wires, like the black and the yellow and the black and the red, they're very thin wires. They're 20 gauge, 0.5 millimeter. It's basically, they're not actually supplying power to anything. Effectively, the ignition is just turning on the relays and therefore turning on and supplying power to the ECU. With the starter one, as I explained earlier, it's just supplying a signal to the ECU to tell it to then output a signal to activate the starter relay to then crank the engine over. Okay, right, so the 6-pin CAN plug, you can see we've got CAN A high and CAN A low. Pin 3 is 12 volts, pin 4 is ground. So those are the 12 volts and ground you can use to power whatever CAN device you want. And then we've got CAN B low and CAN B high. Okay, so that's the CAN plug over there. The expansion one, as I said, it is basically just a 5 volts, a sensor ground, and white 14. So again, if you know FuelTech, you'll see they sort of categorize their pins in different colors. So it'll be like white and blue. Blue can be used for like injectors and outputs for like fuel pump relays and starter motor relays. Then the white is the inputs like sensors, so it can be digital inputs and analog inputs and so on. Then obviously you've got the yellow, which is the H bridges, and then you've got the gray, which is the ignition outputs. Okay, so again, it sounds confusing now, but if you know FuelTech, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. So again, that's called white 14. Then we have the pedal plug, 4-pin, as again I said, drive-by-wire only on there. But basically we've got pin number 1 is a primary accelerator pedal position sensor. Number 2 is secondary accelerator pedal position sensor. And then we have 5 volts, and then we have sensor ground. So again, if you're not using drive-by-wire and you have some sensor inside the vehicle that you want to power, that you need a 5 volt sensor ground and an input, obviously that can be used. Because again, you've got 2 analog inputs there, and obviously it goes from there. Okay, so that's it basically. Right, so those are the extra plugs on there. So hopefully that's really, really straightforward and not too difficult to fathom there. Obviously, we're going to be sending off to the customer. He's going to be fitting it to the vehicle because we've got some other bits we need to do. Obviously, with the CAN, we're going to be fitting a nano. But again, we want to get the measurements when it's in the car. Because this is behind a dash, it's kind of difficult to sort of guesstimate how everything is going to work out. So once he gives us those measurements, we'll build a harness for a nano, which would then be his wideband. He's then going to send us the measurements for the oil, pressure, and temperature sensors. So we'll get a harness made up for those as well. Okay. Right, so that's the layout completely done. As you can see, it's a really, really nice setup. With the modularity, you can change anything. You can change injectors, you can change coils, you can change throttle to a drive-by-wire, you can change your coolant temperature, you can change your idle speed control, you can change from the map sensor in the engine bay to the map sensor in there. We've got fuel pressure as well, and obviously with the oil, we've got the ability to run oil pressure and temperature, and just a normal switch as well if you wanted to. So we kind of hopefully cover all the bases on there. And as I said, With things like the throttle, there's going to be a bunch of stuff open and available to you. So let's say, for example, if you went down the route of having a drive-by-wire throttle, we'd use only 2 of the yellow outputs, not 4. So we could theoretically use one of the other 2 to power a Mac boost valve. If that was the case, you're going to run one of those. And obviously then with the drive-by-wire throttle motor, you'd obviously get rid of the idle speed control because the drive-by-wire would take care of that. So as you can hopefully see, it means that basically you can do whatever you want really, and it's really not that difficult. It's a case of just unplugging a specific harness, phoning us up, we'll make you another one, send it out, you just plug it straight in and then set up the ECU and off you go. Right, so with that being done, we're going to jump into the testing in a second, so bear with me while I get everything ready. See you in a bit. Right guys, so now we're back for the testing of the harness, and first section is going to be just the testing with the ignition on, and second one is with the engine actually running itself. Now obviously with these aftermarket ECUs, we do tend to have a much shorter testing process. There's a lot done off camera, but it would make literally an 1.5 to 2 hour long video if I was to go through every single test that we do. But I'm going to go briefly over what exactly we do off screen. And obviously in terms of what we're going to be looking at here, we're going to be looking at the charge light and the fuel pump relay. That's about it really. We'll test those outputs on there, but I'm going to go quickly through with you exactly what we do off camera. And then in terms of the engine running, we want to make sure the starter circuit works. So we're going to start it. We can either start it actually with the wire there. We can start it with the ECU, with the laptop over there, or we can start it on the actual dash itself. Obviously we're just using the wire for now to make it nice and easy. We'll check the tacho. Obviously it will work on there. You'll see it on the dash being displayed, and then obviously coolant temperature you'll also see displayed on the dash, as well as intake air temperature, TPS, all of that type of information. So again, that's why there's not really much to test with the ignition on and with the engine running, because kind of everything is through the dash. But basically, just to go through what we do essentially off camera, which is what you should do whenever you have an aftermarket ECU and you've done your own wiring harness, or even if you get a wiring harness from someone like ourselves or anybody else, I would always advise to test all these things when you get it back to you, because anything could have happened and you could be chasing your tail for absolutely ages. So on the FuelTech software, you'll see under the sensors and calibration down at the bottom, we've got our outputs function. Now you'll be greeted with this screen over here, and this is going to show you what all your outputs are dedicated to. So you can see down here under the blue, we've got 1 to 8. So that's going to be injector 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. We've then got the fuel pump over there, so that's going to activate the fuel pump. We've got engine starter, so again, that's going to activate the starter relay. And in this case, we've got thematic fan number 1, but normally these two would be open to use for something else if you want to. On the gray section, we've got output 1 to 8, and that's all your ignition coils. So again, same story, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, because we've wired 1 to 1, 2 to 2, 3 to 3. And you'll see here on the yellow outputs, we've got stepper motor, because obviously that's what we are controlling with the yellow outputs in this particular application. If you had drive-by-wire, obviously you'd only be using 2 of these, and effectively you'd just be dedicating 2 of them to drive-by-wire and have the other 2 open. Right, so as you can see, basically all we need to do to test the outputs is effectively push this little lightning button over here, and that's going to activate the output for us over there. Okay, so what I'm going to do now for the fuel pump test, I'm actually going to do that. I'm going to click that button and you should hear the fuel pump turn on. And then obviously the alternator light at the moment, it just displays 1 and 0, so on and off, because it's obviously a digital input that we're using there to ground from the alternator. So first thing we want to do is obviously actually activate the ignition. In this case, I'm imitating that by having this on there. I'm just going to let the fuel pump, you can hear the fuel pump running there because obviously it is being controlled by the ECU, but what we're going to do now is pop over to the dash, and you can see we've got alternator 1, so at the moment it means it's got a ground, and that means that the light would be on your dash if you had the alternator light wired to like a bulb on your dash there. Obviously when the engine starts, that 1 will go to 0, that tells me that the alternator is charging, but obviously you can see actual battery voltage down there as well on the dash. So again, all that information is readily available to you there. You can choose to use that or not. Obviously battery voltage is a really good indicator whether the alternator is charging or not. Okay, so right, so onto the fuel pump relay now. Like I said, all I'm going to basically do is I'm going to activate the output there and test it. So you can see as I hover over it says test, so we'll quickly test, and it does a short little burst, so I'm just going to quickly There you go. But you can hear that the fuel pump is being controlled by the ECU in this case. And obviously that's how I'm testing the outputs. Now, obviously off screen, what we do is we'll actually go through every single injector. We'll make sure that 1 is 1, 2 is 2, 3 is 3, 4 is 4. We'll do exactly the same with the coils. So again, we'll test coil 1, 2, 3, 4. And I usually lift up the coil a bit and I can hear the spark actually happening from there. So I can make sure that that is the correct thing and it is wired up to the correct thing. Okay, and obviously in terms of your inputs, you actually have a bunch of settings down here as well. So you can determine exactly what all your inputs are going to be. So obviously in this case, with drive-by-wire, we'd normally have 2 TPSs and 2 pedal positions. That's what the first 4 are made up. Number 5 is engine temperature, 6 is air temperature, 7 is oil pressure, 8 is fuel pressure, 9 is oil temperature, 10 is map based on the map sensor that I've got hooked up there. 11 is the input for the engine start stop button. 12 is oil pressure switch. So remember that's if you're using just the oil pressure switch. And 13 is the charge light or the alternator light on there. So again, you can obviously test all of those inputs as well, which obviously we do off screen. So I'm not going to bore you with going through that whole entire process. Okay. But basically that's it for the testing with the ignition on. Like I said, because the ECU is the dash, it has everything going to it. So all we want to do is make sure that those things are actually working, like the alternator lights, and we're making sure the fuel pump's being turned on by it and so on. So again, not an extensive testing procedure, unfortunately. But again, I don't want to make 3-hour-long videos where I'm going through and testing every single injector, every single coil, and so on and so forth. But yeah, that's all done off camera for you guys, okay? Right, so I'm going to get prepped, get my ear defenders on, and let's crack in and do the test with the engine running. Right, so we are back now with the engine running section of it. So as I said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start it by just touching the wire on the 12 volts there. That would imitate your key effectively. But as I said, on the laptop, there is actually a button there. I can start it on there. I can also kill the engine from there. And you do have the option of putting the start button on the dash as well. So you kind of got a multitude of options. So if you wanted to just do it via the dash, you could actually just leave that cable disconnected and you wouldn't need to use it. But all options are open, available to you, okay? So as I said, we're gonna be testing the starter circuit. So as long as I touch that wire on there, obviously I've tested the button on the laptop, I've tested the button on the dash, I know they all work, but I'm just gonna do it there, and that tells us the starter circuit is all intact. Relay's doing what it's doing, engine will fire up. Then all we're going to basically do is give it a bit of a rev so you can see that it revs up. We'll go and take a look at the tacho on the dash over there. We'll take a look at the coolant temperature and so on, but you can already see there down there, there's the engine coolant temperature there. It's very difficult to see, but there is actually markings there, like there's 30 degrees you can see, and then the next one, and the next one, and the next one. And obviously we've got intake air temperature over there. So again, it's going to kind of be short and sweet. We're basically going to start it up, give it a rev, make sure you can see everything is running. Obviously we've run this up to temperature a couple of times now. We've got all the cooling fans and everything hooked up to our own little switch. Make sure it gets up to temperature and everything is absolutely fine. But again, this is a completely untuned engine, guys. Again, the FuelTech, another quirk of the FuelTech is they use the very old-fashioned millisecond opening time for the injectors. So all your other ECUs like, Link, Haltech and so on, they use the volumetric efficiency model, whereas these guys use the millisecond. So unfortunately, I couldn't bring in any of my base maps from all of those ECUs and put it into this one to get it to run, absolutely spot on. But again, it's an untuned engine, and I always repeat on these videos, guys, don't spend your time trying to get the engine to run absolutely perfectly. Whatever you do is going to be completely wasted by the time you get to the dyno tuner. He puts it on there, he sorts out the fuel table, sorts out the ignition table. Once that's done, then you can start to look at things like engine start, pulse width on the injectors, and engine coolant temperature compensation, all of that. All of those changes are changes made to the main table. So until the main table is completely correct, everything else that you do is going to be a complete waste of time. So don't fret about trying to get it perfect when you're just getting the engine started, tested up to temperature before you take it for the dyno. Just make sure that it is actually running, that it's not running lean, that it's not running rich, that you have no leaks, that there's no fuel leaks, no coolant leaks. Anything of that nature is going to cause you a problem on the dyno. Make sure it gets up to temperature, make sure your cooling fans come on, make sure you've bled your cooling system. That's basically what you want to do. So it doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be spot on. It doesn't have to idle like absolutely smoothly. You just want to get it running, ready for the dyno. Okay, right, so without further ado, let's pop on. And again, so all I'm going to do literally is touch this on here. There you go. perfect. As you can see, I can kill the engine from the laptop over there. Obviously, the laptop's not going to be connected every single time, but in this case, you need to turn the ignition off, or I'm pretty sure you can kill the engine from the dash if you get that all set up. But yeah, that's it. Basically, she runs absolutely fine. Like I said, I've taken it all the way up to temperature, made sure she's okay. Obviously, I can't rev it up all the way because, again, I don't have a base map for this one, so I am just basically putting numbers in just to see how she behaves. And so yeah, so that's it. So as I said, guys, don't spend days and weeks trying to get it all perfect and trying to do all of that. Don't worry about that stuff. You just want to get the stuff back. You just want to get your car running. You just want to get up to temperature. You just want to make sure that there's going to be no issues on the dyno. That's effectively what you want. Any changes you make to any sort of compensation tables like engine coolant temperature, intake air temperature, off start enrichment, any of those things that you change are going to be affected by the main table. And the main table is going to be completely overwritten and changed by your engine tuner that's going to be tuning the car on the dyno. So again, don't waste your time. But that's it, guys. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. Obviously, I'm going to try and do a video series on this, on how to get everything set up. It is a bit of a complicated ECU. It has taken me a while to get this thing running. So hopefully I can get in touch with FuelTech support and try and see if I can get more information of exactly how to get this thing set up. But there's a couple of things that I know now, obviously things like the 36-2 trigger wheel, how the idle speed control valve works, and so on and so forth. So those things obviously I can go through with you guys. But the rest of it is still a little bit of a mystery for me. Hopefully I can get some more information on that. But other than that, thanks for watching, guys. See you again soon.